Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Dale Stenberg and I are delighted today to be joined a second time by Dr. Michael Ward, professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. And we're here today to discuss his a book that he was just, I think, on our last interview, I think you had just submitted this manuscript maybe that very day, that morning, for the book that we're discussing now, After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I have to say, it was sort of interesting, maybe just going right out of the gate, Dr. Ward. I've probably read The Abolition of Man. I think this was my third time to read it. I read it just before I dipped into your book. And maybe I read it in my late teens and had a typical late teen reaction to it. There's some interesting things here, yay. But it maybe in my late 20s or early 30s, I think I dipped into it again and was just astounded with how much exists in it densely in 80 pages. Yes. And it's been almost a decade perhaps since I've read it. So this was my third time. And this time I've read a bunch of C.S. Lewis between now and then. I'm approaching The Abolition of Man this time. And it seemed to me that it was so dense, that there's so much in these 80 pages in such a deceptively elegant form, that wouldn't it be nice if somebody had a critical apparatus to unveil to everybody everything that's here? And then lo and behold, well, here is this book, After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So I have to say, I had the sensation of realizing how much this book was needed after reading The Abolition of Man again. But maybe that's a segue to saying what was the kind of particular motivation to, this is a peculiar book because it's sort of, one might say, a glorified introduction to the themes and context of Abolition of Man, but then the substance of it is a kind of gloss on all of the little bits in Abolition of Man. If you could put it in your words, what's the motivation for, giving that? I find it automatically valuable, but how would you describe your own motivation for writing it?
Well, principally the motivation of a teacher, because I've been teaching Lewis's works to students now since the early 90s, and I don't always teach The Abolition of Man, but when I do teach it, I've noticed that students find it difficult, and I can sympathize with them, because I remember finding it difficult when I first tried it, and indeed, to a certain extent, I find it difficult still, because I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a trained philosopher. I've never studied philosophy. I've never taught philosophy as such. And so I can sympathize with these difficulties. It is a very dense book. So that's one motivation, just trying to clarify matters and make it more accessible to my immediate students and, of course, to general readers after that. But also, another motivation is that The Abolition of Man is an extremely important work in understanding C.S. Lewis as a whole. It's not just it itself that deserves to be better understood. C.S. Lewis himself will be better understood if we grapple successfully with The Abolition of Man. Lewis himself described it as almost my favorite among my works. And when I've pressed into it and begun to trace its links with his other writings, I can see why Lewis would say that, because it has been described, I think, accurately by some scholars as a linchpin of all Lewis's works. And Lewis's editor, biographer Walter Hooper, described it as an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewisiana. So it's a kind of master key, in a way, that unlocks so much of the rest of Lewis's output.
Yeah, and that makes it the tone of it fascinating, because it reveals perhaps that as a portal to Lewis's whole writing, one of the things that distinguishes it, and I think you mentioned this in your book, is that it's one of Lewis's more somber works almost. It's very serious. The kind of jolly Lewis is still there, but it ends with a little bit of a note of just seriousness. And it's interesting that's perhaps indicative of a larger note of seriousness underneath Lewis's jolly in the whole of his corpus, which is, he deploys these things for serious sense. Dale, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I was going to say maybe what we could do is sort of take each section of the book and talk about that. So, of the abolition of man. And one thing I did want to add to Joe's introduction about the usefulness of the book, it's also very useful for those of us that are not as literate as Lewis. So
Yes.
Lewis assumes of a level of literacy that the reader is already conversant with, which is just to say, he assumes that we have a wide exposure to the Western tradition of great books and philosophy and philosophical categories. And he's writing it at a time that, the title Abolition of Man, and then your title After Humanity, that sort of assumes that his prophetic utterances in the book are sort of coming to fruition in modernity. We seem to be in that after phase. And part of that is just not having a good grounding in our tradition and keeping in line with the thinkers that have come before us. And we don't feel any sort of responsibility to the people that are going to come after us, which is really the whole point of the Tao. So before we get into that, maybe it would be helpful, Dr. Ward, if you give us like a 30,000 foot view of what Lewis is doing in Abolition of Man, and then we'll parachute down into his first part of the book in the way that you give commentary on some of the things he says.
From 30,000 feet, the book is about two things. It's a defense of the objectivity of value, and it's a forecast or a prediction of what will happen to us if we overthrow our belief in the objectivity of value. So on the one hand, it's positive. It is a defense. It's got something positive to offer, namely traditional morality, if you want to call it that. So Lewis uses other terms, and we can come on to that in a moment. But possibly more than a defense, it is this Jeremiah, really. It's a dystopian picture that he's painting of where we are headed in our modern subjectivist contemporary culture. And it doesn't make for very comfortable reading, because Lewis is predicting that we are basically annihilating ourselves as human beings. That's why his book is called The Abolition of Man. And because it's a purely philosophical work, it's not a theological work, it's not a work of Christian apologetics as such, he's content to leave it there on a very bleak note. This is where we are headed. So he's kind of sounding the alarm. And he's not getting so far as offering a Christian solution to the problem that he's raising. He's just wanting to say and get it well established, fixed in our minds, that this is indeed where we are headed. And nobody can like it. Nobody can want us to get there, whether they're Christians or not. But we can come on to that in a moment about who is his precise audience.
And he's using what he calls the Green Book as a sort of jumping off point to get into his larger point. So Joe and I have been talking about your book and Abolition of Man. We were on the Zoom last night for hours, and then we talked this morning for a while. And there's just so much to unpack. So we'll try to economize our conversation to be more efficient. So Lewis was an educator, and he's looking at the offerings of English education for people in lower schools, right? He is concerned about children. And I think that this really was a piece, and maybe you can clarify if you don't think that this was part of the motivation. You've got the meta motivation where between two, we've got the world at war. He sees the impending doom coming with subjectivists. He sees the rise of Hitler and the rest of the world powers at that time, and power and might makes right. It was the prevailing sort of philosophy motivating these actors. But he was also very concerned about the education of children. And it seems like he looked at the Green Book as a Turkish delight handed to Edmund by the White Witch, a sort of temptuous luring of a young mind into the carriage that would take them into prison and ultimately deform the person down into a subhuman species. And he does a good job of not attributing ill motives to the authors of the book, but he nevertheless sees it as very dangerous. So when we talk about the 30,000 view of Lewis sort of battling subjectivism, he gives us the famous story about the waterfall that the Green Book uses, and somebody defines the waterfall as sublime. And the Green Book says, we shouldn't talk this way because that's just to say how you feel about the waterfall. It's not to say anything about the waterfall. And Lewis sort of picks up and goes from there. So what is Lewis trying to do rhetorically and philosophically by shedding light on this thing that the Green Book is drawing children towards? And why did he see it as insidious?
The Green Book is the title Lewis gives to a textbook which was actually entitled The Control of Language. And
Right.
he gives the authors pseudonyms. He calls them Gaius and Titius, whereas in reality they were Alec King and Martin Ketley. So Lewis opens with this discussion in the Green Book, as he calls it, of the waterfall episode, where the romantic poet Coleridge overhears other tourists describing the waterfall. And yes, is it best to call this waterfall sublime, or is it merely pretty? And of course, one could debate the precise application of those terms without becoming a subjectivist. But the whole point, the whole thrust of the presentation of the authors of the Green Book about this episode is that either sublime or pretty, it doesn't matter. Neither term reveals anything objectively true about the waterfall. It's purely a subjective projection from the speaker. And so pretty is no better a term, no worse a term than sublime. It's just, in a sense, irrelevant. It's only telling us things about the internal state of the speaker, not about the reality that they're observing. And this episode is analysed by Gaius and Titius in a book which is supposedly about English composition and the study of literature. It's not supposed to be about advancing a case for subjectivism. And this is one of the things that really gets Lewis's goat, that they're smuggling in this philosophy in a work which is supposed to be about something else. And that would be a bit bad, even if the philosophy was not so deleterious. But because it's a very damaging kind of mistaken philosophy, it's doubly mischievous and regrettable. And so Lewis's sort of hackles rise when he reads this, and he uses it as a kind of rhetorical springboard into his larger case against subjectivism. I think partly because everybody can remember what it was like to read boring textbooks at school.
Yes.
And so it's a kind of easy target from that point of view. We would all like to stick it to some of these boring authors who gave us that grief when we were at school. But also it's rhetorically effective in that, all adults, or hopefully all adults, want to protect children and want to see children educated properly. They may have to, tackle difficult matters, but those difficult matters should be presented with care and honestly, straightforwardly. And so one of the things that Lewis particularly objects to in the Green Book is that it's kind of intellectually dishonest. There's some sort of crime in it, he says. It's not just erroneous, it's sort of criminal at the intellectual level. That there's a kind of subterfuge going on, which he just thinks is a convenient way of getting into his larger case about subjectivism. But we shouldn't spend too much time on the Green Book itself. It really is a rhetorical device, a kind of throat-clearing device, a way of capturing the reader's attention with an easy-to-understand example, and then he's off into his larger case.
one of the things that really surprised me in this reading is he goes on into the second section, because he's using this as a sort of springboard. And he goes on to talk about the way. The criticism of this way of describing things isn't just that there's a philosophical way to argue against it. There is a philosophical argument against it, but there's also something hubristic about not recognizing that nobody's ever described it this way. You're acting like the tradition that would describe this waterfall this way is a tradition that you can just jump out, a stream, a human descriptive tradition, an interpretive tradition you can just jump outside of. But what surprised me in part two this time, reading it at 39 as opposed, when I last read it, is that Lewis does have an account of the way he uses Tao. I tend to kind of substitute natural law or something like that. And there's a rough correspondence there. And he even mentions natural law or practical reason. But he also does mention the idea that the Tao can change. And I found that a very fascinating, in part two, he has this notion that he's actually not telling everybody you can't sort of modify what human tradition and custom looks like within the tradition, but it can only come appropriately from within the Tao itself. That's where he says, only from within the Tao can the Tao be, whatever. And in the name of probably a sort of peripheral axiom in the name of a deeper axiom. Sort of resolving itself. And this is something I see in so much of Lewis' corpus, that it's, the discarded image. Of course, parts of this aren't technically true, but the discarded image is a crucial still for us. And you see this in, in That Hideous Strength. He doesn't treat Merlin as sinister for having his moral instincts about, killing the servant, right? Lewis really does imagine Merlin is still in the Tao. He's just from a moment in time where a connection to the Tao was inflected a bit differently and sort of out of place. But that whole element of it was fascinating to me, that Lewis is very sensitive as a natural law thinker, and in his argument here to the idea that you don't really access natural law sort of just directly and get the pure distillate. It's always inflected through a historical condition, so that the objective and the subjective are kind of united in a real the human life just is the union of these. And he's assuring, in a sense, and I wonder what you think, he's almost assuring a modern reader, I'm not saying that moral trajectory cannot be corrected. Of course it can be corrected. But if you just jump outside the thing, then you're almost certainly just going to get nowhere. Anyway, I'm fascinated by that play with natural law, and I'm kind of curious. Yeah.
Well, first of all, for your listeners who aren't familiar with the Abolition of Man, we should explain what we mean by the Tao, or rather, what is by the Tao. We haven't explained that term yet, but it's a Chinese term. It's taken from Confucian philosophy. We pronounce it Tao. It's T-A-O. And Lewis chooses this term from Eastern thought, in large part to emphasize the fact that the thing he's arguing for is universal. This is humanity's ethical inheritance that comes to all human beings, regardless of where they find themselves, either on the globe or in the chapters of history, because this awareness of the objectivity of moral value is, that's just a kind of polysyllabic way of talking about good and evil, right and wrong, or, to put it more bluntly and perhaps in more obviously Christian terms, the conscience.
Yeah.
All human beings have been invested with this awareness of right and wrong by their creator, and as a result, this is a good baseline for a description of what it is to be genuinely human. So he uses the term the Tao to wrong foot those who will assume that he's making a purely Western and Christian case, or that he's merely defending what everybody will already know to be natural law. he's doing something a little bit different from that. Actually, he's wanting to talk about a kind of moral ecology that we all breathe, an ethical atmosphere that we inhabit by virtue of belonging to this species, and we can't get out of it. We may pretend that we can get out of it, but we never really do, because it's inescapable. It's fundamental. It's paradigmatic to our nature as human beings. And so, when it comes to the question you were raising there, Joseph, about possible developments from within this moral ecology, yes, of course, there can be developments. The classic example is the advance from the silver rule to the golden rule. The silver rule is do not do to others as you would not have them do unto you. That's the silver rule. And the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. From a negative to a positive, that's a moral advance, you might say. That's a crystallization of a moral truth. But it's clearly, the latter step is clearly compatible with the former step and is indeed a natural outgrowth of it. And if you don't see that one ought to lead to the other, then you're not really morally literate. And there are other ways in which, the Tao can be refined and improved and so on and so forth. But all these advances must happen from within it, and they must be organic. Right. They must be natural. They must be, like the growth of a tree from acorn to oak, or like the growth of a human person from baby to adult. Moral maturity can be increasingly arrived at. It will never be finally arrived at, because to put an end to moral development would be to put an end to history. Because by the very fact that history is going on and new situations are developing and new perceptions are being arrived at, inevitably moral understandings will be increasingly refined. The fine tunings may be very, 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 very fine the further you go on, but nonetheless, at least in principle, they can continue to be made.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that so he ends that first chapter, Men Without Chess, with the famous line that everybody quotes on social media, right? We bid the Gildings, we castrate the Gildings and bid them their doing. But it's interesting the tripartite division that Lewis makes with man. And it's not a theological argument. He's not saying this is how we theologically sort of carve up man. He really is getting at like the lower animal appetites and reason come together in the chest, the seat of your emotions. And this is what the authors of the Green Book are sort of trying to get rid of. And in a twist of irony, it really is that they are trying to prevent subjectivism from taking over, while at the same time playing into the hands of the subjectivist philosophy, precisely because they deny the seat, which is sentimentality and emotion, to sort of synthesize the reason and the animal instinct. So it's in the heart, it's in the chest that we need to sort of become a whole person. That's where the holistic vision of a person is this marriage between the stomach and the head in the chest. What I find interesting, so like properly ordered loves. I'm starting a classical Christian school here in Central Florida, and that's our motto, Ordinatio Mores. And one thing that I tell the parents is what we're going to teach your kid when they come to our school is how to love that which is lovely and hate that which ought to be hated. And that's really what Lewis is saying. The whole thrust of that first chapter is to say there are things which are intrinsically lovely, which do pull on our emotions and our sentimentality, and that when we use words to describe that thing that should be that elicits out of us a sense in all of the lovely, then we are giving it justice. We're giving it due explanation on the way that God has designed that thing to affect us in our reason, but also in our animal instincts, and find a synthesis in the chest. So if that's true, then when we're talking about sort of changing the Tao, we're not saying that everyone brings to bear on the natural order of things their own subjective analysis of either the worthiness of this thing to be called lovely, or the unworthiness of this thing to be called ugly, but that it just is inside of the thing, and to move into a description of the Tao is almost impossible, because it's not that you can reduce the Tao to a proposition, it's that the Tao actually elicits something out of you, right? And that's the telos of that particular thing. You see a butterfly, you see a caterpillar go into its cocoon and emerge as a butterfly. All you can do is give it its proper respect. I wonder, this is sort of an abstract question, Dr. Ward, but I wonder, in the modern age, do you think that we're missing that to a certain extent? And if we are, I mean, I almost want to say that's not even worthy a question to be asked, because obviously I think we're missing it in big chunks. But if that is a phenomenon of the modern age, to sort of question or balk at the idea that something is intrinsically lovely and we can attribute value to that thing via language, or if we don't love that which is lovely, but we venerate that which is unlovely, what has given rise to this? So if he was a prophet sort of speaking into the future, is it really because we've sort of given up the objective understanding of value, and we've taken to ourselves a godlike posture towards nature, where we can make it malleable and fit whatever our imagination comes up with? Or, I know I'm sorry, I tend to ask these questions, but I think it's worthy of an answer. So,
yes. The very last thing you said was interesting to me, because it connects with the fictional counterpart to the abolition of man, namely that hideous strength, where you were saying we can just make things up according to our own will, we can make it up ourselves, and that puts me in mind of the men of the Tower of Babel, who want to make a name for themselves by building a tower to the heavens, by making themselves godlike, as it were. And of course, that hideous strength, the third novel in Lewis's Ransom trilogy, which is the fictional counterpart to the abolition of man. Right. That very phrase, that hideous strength, is derived from a poem about the Tower of Babel. So, yeah, it's a kind of usurpation of moral foundations, subjectivism, that is, that you take it upon yourself to determine a priori, effectively, what is good and what is evil. It's just a product of your will. It's a product of your preference, your whim, your appetite, your digestion, the state of the weather, random association of ideas, heredity. All these non-rational or irrational causes are leading you to say, I think that's good and not that. Whereas in a traditional human understanding of what is good and evil, we don't make it up, we discover it. Right and wrong are not things that we invent, we unearth them as we grow into our humanity. This is what it means to be a well-adjusted, well-developed human being. And so, yes, hence the physical model that Lewis gives of the chest being the liaison officer between cerebral man and visceral man. The head and the belly are united in the chest, which is the fundamentally human organ, as it were, because from the sternum down, we're appetites and senses and emotions and passions, and in that respect we're like the animals. From the neck up, we're rational, and to that extent we're like the angels, or possibly like the demons. Combine the angelic and the animal in the chest, and you have the anthropological. This is because one of the classic definitions of the human being is a rational animal.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the important points in Lewis's argument is that we shouldn't be ashamed of our animality.
Right.
We have passions, yes, we have senses, we have sentiments, and those are good.
Yeah.
But they are good when they are ordered and disciplined, when they become just sentiments, when they become civilized sentiments, regular and stable emotions. And so we're not just at the mercy of our passions, neither are we squelching our passions by an over-emphasis upon the head, upon the rational, the cerebral. We are integrated. We can feel, but we can also understand. We can know and we can sense. And this is what it means to be a balanced and integrated human being.
Yeah, this is where his emphasis, I think he has this fascinating structure throughout the book where he compares the power of some men over other men. And he does this in several ways, but one of the things that strikes me is that, precisely because of the way humans learn and how we are and in the mode in which God is sort of establish us to be connected to the Tao, inflected through a community, the radical move, and this is actually, kind of similar to almost a Burkean critique of, just radicalism as a sort, like the lack of wisdom in just radically moving outside of the tradition is that you lose what tradition, a moral ecology inflected through a tradition, if you will, gives you. And what Lewis is really sensitive to, I think, in a way that is often missed in some critiques, is the way in which that's always the establishment of a new subservience. You're not actually getting free. What really goes on outside the Tao is that some men's vision of the good is actually reigning over is actually calling the shots for some other men. And that's true with posterity, that's true, and he shows it in all these ways. But even when you get down to the man, which part of that some man is ruling other men? Is it the head of that man? Well, no, it's actually just the appetites of some man, by mediated through cultural influence, effectively controlling other men. And so you actually wind up belonging to a much less thick, as it were, in a much less wise tradition of sorts. The world for the masses is still mostly mediated by authority and influence. But in this case, for a man who's in himself irrational, and that's the kind of image of the demonic consciousness that then you see inflected through the nice in that hideous strength. And a parallel to that I think of is I have 4 children, and my wife and I are raising a daughter. We're fairly modern people. It's fine if she grows up and be an astronaut. We're fine. That's wonderful. But it struck me as I was thinking of the just television shows or the stories that I see available to her as a young girl, and it struck me how I almost never see depictions of motherhood in media for young girls to look at and say, oh, isn't that cool to be a mom? And that doesn't mean I don't want girls to grow up and be astronauts, but nevertheless, this sort of depiction of a mother to inspire young girls, I thought to myself, well, there's the abolition of man. I mean, there's the power defining what the good and the true and the beautiful is by means of media for children has decided to some extent, at some place, that people with power are actually deciding we don't actually want to make stories that tell little girls this is what's actually good for them. We will only give these messages. That's a little bit of a long-winded way of saying things, but it's nevertheless inspired that some men, other men structure I find really, really fascinating in Lewis, and I think a very good way for most people to see how the abolition of man is actually accomplished in the human consciousness, because it's almost the abolition of man is almost an atrophy of human faculty, where you don't realize what you've lost. Motherhood, you could think you've lost nothing, in fact,
and gained something actually.
But and even gained something, exactly. But it can only be something you tell yourself by virtue of something atrophying in you. And Lewis is almost trying to, it seems to me, like wizard charm that piece of you awake to feel again. Is that a decent reading of what he's doing with the kind of the some men, other men thing? I think that's it's one of the very few quotes in the book, actually, that is explicitly quoted in That Hideous Strength. He puts it in the mouth of one of the character who gets murdered. Uses this line from Abolition of Man. Yeah.
Yeah. When we try to step outside the Tao, we render ourselves less than human. And as a result, we begin to tyrannize other people with our own misshapen understanding of the Tao. Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with you, Joseph, about the lack of healthy depictions, positive depictions of motherhood. I would only supplement it by saying that there are almost no healthy or positive depictions of fatherhood.
Yes. Yes, this is true. Yes.
Or indeed of marriage.
Yes.
And it's very interesting, by the way, this is one of the least popular aspects of the Abolition of Man. It's very interesting how Lewis talks about contraception.
Yes.
A moral change which he saw happening in the course of his own life. Until 1930, all Protestant churches were against contraception. And then his own Anglican church began to revise that ethic and opened the door to contraception in a way which was novel. And I think Lewis himself had strong doubts about the validity of that change, that this was not a true development of ethical understanding. It was a distortion. And that's why in That Hideous Strength, of course, Mark and Jane Studdock, the protagonists, they have a contracepted marriage, and the novel ends with a grand lovemaking feast.
Yes.
In which the heir, the true Pendragon, is going to be conceived. So, there's a lot going on in the Abolition of Man.
That's right.
Some of which law-abiding Christians would begin to feel discomforted by, I suspect. So I think we need to be aware that Lewis is talking about a tendency to sin, which is in all of us. And it's not just those terrible people over there who are wanting to manipulate others. Insofar as we suppress our knowledge of the good and sin in particular ways, we are taking precisely the same step. But that's to put it in theological and spiritual religious terms. And of course, in The Abolition of Man, Lewis is only working in philosophical terms.
Right.
But it's all the same thing, fundamentally.
Yes.
And by the way, to go back to the Tao, the Tao can be quite properly translated, I believe, as the way. And indeed, Lewis gives the second chapter of The Abolition of Man the title, The Way.
Right.
But it's interesting how, Lewis, with his canny rhetorical gifts, is sort of slipping under the radar, as it were, another term for Christianity. Because, of course, in the Acts, also, the early Christians are the followers of the way. And of course, Jesus himself in John's Gospel says, I am the way.
The way.
Right.
In the life. And in one of Lewis's letters, he says that if he were writing from a purely theological point of view, he might well argue that the Tao is the Word, capital W. theologically considered or philosophically considered, depending on which angle you're coming at it from. The strategy Lewis is using in The Abolition of Man is philosophical and intellectual, but the same set of arguments could really be couched in purely theological terms if he were writing for a specifically theological audience. But he's not.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why he, in The Abolition of Man, has achieved such wide readership, and so many different categories of person admire this book. Christians of all stripes, evangelicals, Catholics, and everyone in between, but also atheists. We have in Britain currently a quite prominent British atheist philosopher called John Gray, and he recently gave a whole BBC radio broadcast devoted to The Abolition of Man, in which he said that he regarded it as prescient, prophetic, and as relevant now as it was when it first came out, if not more so. And he's an atheist. But he's an atheist of goodwill. That is to say, he's an atheist who believes in the objectivity of value, and therefore he sees the value of what Lewis is trying to defend.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that his methodology for going about penning this particular work, what you said, it reveals a lot about Lewis the man, and I think that's right. Lewis was very concerned to not sort of be pigeonholed into, I'm a Christian apologist, right? I think so many of the modern day sort of courses on apologetics, young men go into looking for the professor to hand them the hatchet upon which they will chop down the tree of, modern day skepticism or whatever. Whereas the methodology of Lewis was more like, let me slip the scabbard in between the fine little break in the armor and hit the artery in the heart in the perfect way, so that way they're going to bleed out and that idea will die. And he does it through he does it by like cloaking himself as not purely Christian. This isn't something about The Abolition of Man, but it is. I was just having this conversation this past Sunday with two people in a church that I was visiting about the practice of apologetics, and you're a professor of apologetics, so this seems very apropos. Do you think that Lewis's method, his method towards speaking, well, both prophetically, but also to the people of his time, how he tried to disarm the critics by not painting himself as a purely religious figure, but pointing to things that we all just swim in? That's the Tao. I think he's just saying, listen, it doesn't matter whether you affirm this or not. This is just the way that you operate. But his method of doing that in trying to pull people to see objective value, not from a purely Christian perspective, but from a sort of meta-narrative, archetypal structure of reality that's embedded in stories and myths and nature herself. Is this something that has largely been lost in contemporary apologetics? And if it has, is it something that's worthy of rediscovering?
Well, it's certainly worthy of rediscovery. To the extent to which it has been lost, that's a whole other topic, and that takes us somewhat away from The Abolition of Man. So
right.
let's bracket that, if you don't mind. But
sure.
But the question of should it be rediscovered or should it be engaged in as a apologetic strategy? Absolutely, yes, because it's foundational. Christians want to preach the good news of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior of mankind, but who is he saving if not people who are morally corrupted? And you can only acknowledge yourself to be morally corrupted if you acknowledge the existence of the objectivity of value which you have offended or fallen short of in some fashion or other. So as Lewis points out in Mere Christianity and in his more explicitly Christian works, the good news of Jesus Christ begins with the bad news of our sin.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can only acknowledge yourself to be sinful if you acknowledge there to be an objective moral framework which you are not living up to. So it's absolutely foundational to any kind of apologetic, let alone any evangelism, that the objectivity of value be defended and be explained. It's St. Paul all over again, isn't it, in his letter to the Romans, where he's talking about how I happen to have the letter to the Romans open in front of me. How what can be known about God is plain to them, that is to say, those outside the law. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, his eternal power and deity have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. That's in chapter 1, and then in chapter 2, the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, and are therefore a law unto themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or perhaps excuse them. So St. Paul himself is taking this idea of natural theology, of conscience, of common grace, as a baseline, only above which can the structure of a full apologetic and evangelistic presentation be constructed. So it's so foundational, this book. You can see why it has won a secure place as a classic, because there are not many books which, as it were, go to the, I know, Joseph, you like this phrase, go ad fontes, go to the fountain of ethical consideration. Everybody just sort of presupposes it, as of course you naturally do for something that is presupposed. Right. But defending that the premise of the objectivity of value is not often done, and this is why I think this has acquired such a solid place in Lewis's repertoire, that he's bothering to do something which is so obvious in one sense that nobody would think it would be worth doing.
Yeah,
it is worth doing for all sorts of reasons.
In the and maybe this is a good sort of final segue as we wind down here, but one of the things you say in your guide before you get into the commentary section is there's a word that shows up, and there's many good comments you make in here, but there's a word that shows up very rarely in the text, but what you argue is a big idea behind the text, and that is the word participation. And I'd be curious if you could tell the listeners, they want to go to the text. What is it that the theme of participation does in the Abolition of Man? Because it's sort of implicit throughout as kind of a category for Lewis. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. So I wonder if you could, it might be a good final thing to offer those to get your book and to reread Lewis.
Yeah, well, participation in the Tao, participation in this moral ecology is that which makes us human. It is a sine qua non of humanity. Lewis is really just attempting to define what it means to be human. Obviously, he would like ultimately people to be not just human, but Christian as well as human.
Yeah.
But you can only be a Christian human being if you're first a human being.
Yeah.
So, as it were, let's sit down and decide what it is to be human from an ethical point of view. And it is this involvement in, this engagement with, this inhalation of the ethical atmosphere or ethical ecology, which not only surrounds us externally, but which we actually breathe in. And so this is why I like to use the image of oxygen or atmosphere, it is very participative kind of metaphor, that moral objectivity is not just something out there, which we have to discern, and that we can read off like a railway timetable or the periodic table of elements. It's not that simple. It's organic, it's holistic, it gets inside us, we can breathe it in.
Yes.
We have to take it into ourselves so that it impresses our very bodies. And, we've already talked about the chest.
Yes.
It's interesting how that is not just a philosophical model, it also seems to carry over into a certain understanding of man physiologically considered. And you see this actually in the Narnia Chronicles, where Peter Pevensey, King Peter, High King Peter, grows up, we're told, in the Lion in the Wardrobe, to become a tall and deep-chested man. Whereas Shift, the ape, the Antichrist-like ape in the final comedy, the last battle, he tells us that apes always have weak chests. And so there's something actually physical, or that could be manifested physically in a well-ordered moral system. You were talking, Dale, about your school's ethos of training the loves, the ordo amoris, as St. Augustine calls it, or as Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics.
Yes.
Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. In taking on these appropriate loves and disapprovals too, we train our bodies as well as our souls, actually. You can see this at a very rough and ready level, of course, can't you? In people who abuse alcohol or drugs. It's not just a moral abuse in their spirit or their soul. It begins to have effects upon their physique, upon their complexion, upon their whole body. Because morality is not just something spiritual. It's something much more tangible, much more palpable than that. And that's why participation, breathing it in, swimming in it, all these images of involvement, I think are much better ways of talking about what Lewis is getting at.
It's interesting he uses the language. I'll just say this last thing, Dale, but it sort of pulls together a couple of themes. Those who understand the spirit of the Tao and who have been led, and this is a fascinating phrase to use in a secular context, and who have been led by that spirit can modify it in directions which that spirit itself demands. And it's interesting to think of Lewis would undoubtedly be, and maybe I'm speculating here, but undoubtedly I would think be aware of the metaphor of spirit is also a metaphor of breath. And it's interesting to think of the role of the chest as sort of participating, breathing it in. Breathing in the Tao is to sort of breathe in its spirit, perhaps. That's a very ancient metaphor. And that is actually what enables you to shift, if it needs any tweaks, by that spirit. You're actually able to tweak it according to itself, in a sense, according to its own demands. That's another interesting comment. It's not just a free-for-all, maybe it needs a tweak. It needs to be tweaked if it needs to be tweaked. And that's a very interesting comment as well. Go ahead, Dale.
Well, no, I wasn't. You mentioned spirit, but maybe there's so much to talk about, Dr.
Yeah, I know.
We can. It's hard to leave it off. It's hard to close the conversation down because we really could go for another hour. But Joseph and I were talking about, because Lewis does use the word spirit throughout, the spirit of the Tao. And when Joe began talking earlier about sort of tweaking the Tao within the Tao to sort of contextualize the Tao's moral obligations in new epochs of God's providence, it nevertheless is tethered to an objective value system. Yeah. But it's more along the lines of keeping the spirit of the Tao rather than the letter of the Tao. So the letter of the Tao might be such and such in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And then, mobilization happens. You've got pluralism and the rise of sort of nihilism and secularism, and you have all these humans smashing into one another over the globe, and ideas conflicting. I think that what Lewis is saying is the moment that you step outside of the spirit of the Tao, which is a sort of a priori commitment to that thing which just becomes natural to you when you look at the world, that's when you become less of a human. But I do wonder this. This is one of my, because I've been asked this, and maybe we'll close it off with this question, because I have the best questions, and Joe just sort of...
Of course, yeah.
Right.
Save the best for last.
Yeah. How does one, what does it actually look like to become less of a human or to not be a human? So Tolkien got at it with the orcs, right? But what is it actually, what is the tangible manifestation of something that's less than human but looks like a human by all physical appearances? What does that even sort of translate into? So when Lewis says we're abolishing what it means to be a man, and if you step outside of the Tao, then you're not a human anymore. What does that person look like? Not physically, but what is it that they're sort of, is it just an idea? Is it a way to think about reality? Do we look at those people? Because I do wonder if that language can be co-opted for nefarious purposes to sort of paint their political opponents in ways that would justify abusing them, because these are no longer humans, they're just animals.
Yeah.
And
abortion providers are no longer humans, so yeah.
So kill them because they're not doing the right thing. How does this cash out in real practical modern ways that we can say, okay, yes, they are stepping out, they're at least attempting to step outside of the Tao, but how do what does that mean actually?
Well, you're asking philosophically, not physiologically, but before we get into the philosophical, I'm reminded of how two characters in That Hideous Strength are described. Two of the chief villains, Wither and Night and Frost, who are the head honchos of the Nice. And it's interesting how they are described in sort of equal and opposite terms. They've both been involved in the same process whereby all specifically human reactions have been killed in them. But the process has, and I quote here, the process has condensed and sharpened Frost into the hard, bright little needle that he now was, while it has distended and dissipated Wither into a shapeless ruin. And I describe those descriptions as what you might call centripetal and centrifugal subjectivisms, that you can collapse into yourself and become incredibly egoistic if you're a subjectivist, or you can, as it were, just collapse outward and, like a handful of dust scattered across the universe, you become airy-fairy, wishy-washy. And either extreme is an error. And I think, if we look around our culture, and indeed if we look inside our own hearts, we can see the extreme to which some people are tempted. I myself, I think, have a tendency in the Frost direction. I'm one of those who clamps down, who clenches the teeth and other parts of the body in an unhealthy kind of tension and kind of frigidity or rigidity. Whereas you see other people who just, easy come, easy go, happy-go-lucky types who, in one sense, are more relaxed, but in another sense have no borders to their personality. And so when it comes to your larger question about, well, what was your larger question?
Well, no, I think you're getting at
Yeah.
it precisely, is what does it look like to become sort of not human anymore when we do descend into when man is abolished, when the abolition of man has come to fruition. What does it look like? And I think you're doing a perfect job of explaining that
Yeah.
through Hideous Strength and your personal experience. And let me just say, before you finish, that what you're explaining with your temperance seems to be sort of like close in, like a rigidity. And then you have the people that are just dust in the wind and there are no borders. That is a perfect way to describe Joseph Minnick and Dale Stenberg, actually. So yes, brother, this is a trinity of conversation that is
error
unified
and carnage, apart from the
Yes.
grace of the Lord. Yeah, that's right.
Yes. So that was really it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
But to go back to your point about those who try to step outside the Tao, I mean, Lewis, not exactly quotes, but he's alluding to Chesterton. Chesterton talked about how the virtues have gone mad in a subjectivist culture, that people seize upon one particular aspect of morality and they expand it to madness.
Yes.
Swollen to madness in isolation from every other value.
Yeah.
And so one way, and so I think this was the other element of your question, Dale. What's a practical way of pushing back against this tendency? Well, it's just always to, as it were, throw your weight on the other side of the boat to try to equal things out. If you find yourself becoming out of kilter, try to do the opposite thing of the thing that you naturally find yourself inclined towards. Because, as Lewis likes to point out in Screwtape and elsewhere, the devil loves to put errors into the world in pairs, so that by avoiding this error, you're dragged almost unwittingly, unnoticingly into this error. It's the technique of divide and rule. This is polarization. It's a classic strategy in warfare. And so in our own lives, we can hopefully become aware of our natural temperamental tendency in a certain direction and take steps to correct it. And in engaging with the larger culture, we can say, and Lewis himself says this in The Abolition of Man, that, if for instance, I'm not getting the wording exactly right, but if scientific honesty is a value, so is conjugal fidelity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And not all of us who are, modern day scientistic kinds of people would see any kind of
Correlation.
between honesty about your scientific data and being true to your promises to your spouse. But it's a continuum.
Right.
And
Right.
you can't have one without the other, ultimately.
Right.
Yes. Well, brother, thank you very much. Dr. Ward, your work is continuing to get better as you age, brother. So we're looking forward to your next project. And if you have any little hints that you want to throw out on anything you're working on, this is where all the little good morsels could simmer in the conscience of the listeners. If not, no worries at all. But
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you.
So I better not go there.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, it was a great book. Pick it up. After Humanity. I always take the dust jacket off because I like the pure.
There you go. Yeah.
Yes, there we go. Yes. Pick it up. We will have a link for everyone to buy it. Dr. Ward has also written Planet Narnia, which was a life-altering book for me. Pick that up if you haven't yet. You can always head over to daveninstitute.org to find all of the information about what we're doing with Davenant Institute. Head over to the Davenant Institute YouTube page. You can find the rest of our podcasts there, and you can go over to iTunes or any of your podcast catchers and check out the previous episodes, including the one we did with Dr. Ward on Planet Narnia. But Dr. Ward, thank you, brother. Appreciate your time. Yes. Joe, love you.
Love you too, man.
And we will see you all next time.
See you next time.
See ya. Bye.